Today's shir is sponsored by Susan Jerkowitz and family, we could say. Alina's here, and family. So it's to commemorate the Jean's yard site, which is on Wednesday. It's his 8th yard site. It's Elazar ben Mordechai. So the Neshama Shavan Aliyah, so we do thank you for an enhanced shir, not because of the shir, but because of the coffee. Okay? So we do thank you indeed. Parshas Lech Lecha. Good morning. Parshas Lech Lecha. Mala. Upstairs. Page 54. Page 54, Parashat Lech Lecha, which is about a journey to the land of Israel of our patriarch and matriarch, Avram and Sarai. If you are ever bored on an El Al flight, right? For example, before they put on they've upgraded to the Dreamliner that has screens in every seat, and you don't have what to do. So you can play the following game, perhaps. That you look around the people on the plane, and you try by looking at them, perhaps if you could get a little peek into their luggage, or into the type of books they are holding, or the conversations they are having. You could try perhaps to figure out what their destination is in Israel, what they're going to see, right? So if you, for example, see someone sitting in one of the aisles and they're wearing a cross, you could assume that they're not going to be going to Mea Shearim, hopefully at least, but rather they're going to be going to one of the churches, right? You could assume that. I remember flying once from Atlanta. There was once a Delta flight from Atlanta to Israel, and I was a minority on the plane. I was a real minority on the plane, but the love for Israel was awesome on that plane. They love all the Jews, right? They're waiting for all of us to make our way to Israel, and then that part we skip. But that's on the old joke when the plane lands in late December in Israel, and it lands in Israel before it gets to the gate, right? That the pilot announces to all those who are sitting, Merry Xmas, and to those standing, Happy Hanukkah. Right? That's the old joke. So you could most probably assess based on what they're carrying in their luggage, their appearance. You can also most probably assess what perhaps will disappoint them a touch. Right? What's going to agitate them? Right? Being stuck in traffic, perhaps, because there is some kind of hafgana against the draft. I don't know. There's most probably you could assess. You can get a picture. My point is, on your way to Israel, your journey to Israel, which is every single journey to Israel is a significant one, right? A few of you are on your way, right? Every trip is significant. You could assess what their vision of the land is and what they are trying to achieve there. Now, Abraham is on a journey to the land of Israel. And we can ask ourselves, what exactly is he trying to achieve in Israel? So we're going to look at what he's carrying with him, what he brings with him. And that will give us a little bit of a picture of what he sees there, or a little bit of a picture of what he wants to see there, and what he is trying to accomplish as he is in the land that God Almighty told him to make his way there. Now, we're going to also notice a little bit of a shift. Sometimes you arrive in your vacation destination and it is not exactly the way you envisioned it. Right? They send you on some kind of a group tour or some kind of trip, a Jewish tour, and you think that you're going to be seeing these magnificent islands, and perhaps they don't look as nice as they appear in the pictures, right? So there's a level of adjustment that has to take place when you reach your destination. That will be occurring as well, but there's going to be a hint if we read carefully into the instructions given by God to Avram. We will actually see in it the potential for some things not going his way. Vayomer Hashem el Avram, So Avram says, is being told by God in verse 1 of chapter 12 on page 54, Lech Lecha, you're going to go for yourself. It could also be Lecha, you're alone in some ways. It's a lonely journey for the Jew. Me'artzecha, from your land. Umi moladetecha, and from your relatives. Umi bet avicha, from your father's house. El haaretz asher areka. Very well-known verse. It's the beginning of the Jewish journey. Now, what is the goal of the Jewish journey? Ve'escha legoy gadol. In other words, you want to achieve something. As we'll see soon, you have this desire, this mission to reach out, to educate humanity, to teach them values. So I'm going to give you the opportunity of doing it not just as an individual, but rather as a great nation. And va'avarechecha, I'm going to bless you. Okay, and your name will be great, meaning that which you want to achieve and you are only achieving on a small scale in this region, in Aram, that which you are doing just to a few locals, I will give you the opportunity. I'm going to be placing you in the land that is a platform to humanity. Human race will always be looking at Israel, and there's always going to be significant coverage of what's happening in Israel. Unfortunately, it makes its appearance on the negative side quite often when the world is obsessed with what Israel is doing. But on the other hand, eventually it's going to reach its full potential of the world turning to the platform and learning values from what is occurring in the land of Israel, and therefore, v'agadela shemecha there, v'heyeh beracha, and you shall be a blessing. Now, Avraham, up until now, is being told that, listen, you are doing good things, you will continue doing good things in the land of Israel. And you will be a blessing, you will bring blessing to humanity. Really, the essence of blessing is recognizing that everything is from God, and that is what's going to occur. But in verse 3, there's going to be a hint of some trouble waiting for Avram. Ve'avarcha mevarechecha, indeed I will bless those who bless you, but umekalelcha aor, and those who curse you will be cursed. Those that curse you will be cursed. Right? A principal is guiding a teacher into his first experience as a teacher, and he's giving him guidance of how much he could achieve and the impact the teacher could have, and then he gives him a helmet, and he asks, what's the helmet for? He says, just in case one of the students throws a baseball at you, it's good to have a helmet, right? So that helmet being handed to the teacher indicates this classroom is not going to be this ideal way I have envisioned it. So here's God's helmet given to Avraham, that you should know that those who curse you will be cursed. Trouble. But the reality is that the blessing to humanity is going to be coming through you v'nivrachu b'cha kol mishpechot ha'adama. Fine? So finally, he gets his instructions in 3 verses. He begins his journey with Lot, a cousin, right, his nephew. Ve'avraham, and Avraham is 75. Who does he take with him? So verse 5, he takes his wife. Later, the relationship seems to strengthen a little bit, where he doesn't have to take his wife, because when they leave Egypt, they leave as a pair. But for the time being, he takes his wife. He takes Lot. And then, if you look on the bottom of the page, the last 5 words, which will give us an indication what Avraham is going to achieve in the land of Israel, that with the items on his list that he had were the nefesh asher asu becharan. He takes with him from Haran the nefesh, the souls that he made. What exactly does it mean to make souls, and what does it mean to take them? So some would say, well, perhaps these were slaves and servants, but if the Torah lists it, and it is identified as a soul being made and not a soul being purchased, it seems to indicate that this is what Avraham was involved in. He had an impact on people, meaning there were people who recognized the Creator up until that point, but they did not put time and effort into being sure that others are aware of our responsibility towards the Creator. Comes Avraham and he has an impact on others. He makes souls and he takes them with him because they are part of his family now. And that is what he wants to achieve in Israel. He wants to go ahead and have an impact on the world. The world should recognize this idea of monotheism, that there's a God, that there is a God that's not just interested in you burning animals, but there are values, and that as a Jew or as a human, you should appreciate what the world has to offer, recognize God made blessings. All these ideas, he made people already, and he wants to make more, and eventually they arrive in Eretz Yisrael. So now you turn next page to verse 6, which is a very exciting verse because this is the entry of Avraham to Eretz Yisrael. And this symbolizes Avraham's entry into Eretz Yisrael. It symbolizes Yaakov's entry many years later when he had a family already. It symbolizes, because it's establishing a pattern for our ancestors after the many years in the wilderness as they entered into Eretz Yisrael. And it symbolizes every single time a Jew makes his way to Israel and lands in Israel. Every single time a Nefesh B'Nefesh flight lands there and makes its way to Eretz Yisrael, all of that is right here in this verse, where Avraham enters into the land. And there is no doubt that it will be quite significant for us to identify the location where he, which is identified first, meaning obviously when you enter at Ben Gurion, right? Or in those days you entered at some border crossing in the north. But the first location identified is going to be a significant one for us, that we have to analyze why the Torah spells out that Avraham makes his way there first. Vayavor, so here we go. Vayavor Avraham ba'aretz, and he passes into the land. And then he reaches Makom, the location of the future Shechem. I say the future Shechem because Shechem is actually a person who appears a few parashiyot from now. He's not alive at this time, but when the Torah is written a few hundred years later in the days of Moshe, it is known as Shechem. So therefore, it's identified as the location of Shechem. But the actual name, and this is obviously going to be significant, so here we go. The first location mentioned for Avraham Avinu and Sarai is Elon Moreh. They reach Elon Moreh. So what's in Elon? It's a type of tree, a terebinth, a biblical terebinth. You could look up. This is a tree that is noticeable from a distance. And it would be quite logical that if you would want to identify a location, you would say that it is near, or you pass the terebinth. There's no question about that. If you see these trees, type of oak. And this is the Elon of Moreh. Okay? Elon Moreh. Significant of a piece of information, number one. Now, the rabbis tell us that this is the future location of where our ancestors, after the years in the wilderness, made their first stop. Because as they crossed the Jordan River, their first actual stop is near Shechem, where they stood by two big mountains, Har Grizim and Har Eval, and they enter into a covenant. Now, what's the idea of the covenant there? So the commentators explain that the Jew, as he enters Eretz Yisrael, has to remember that you have a responsibility, that your actions in Israel bring about results. You're good in Israel, you're righteous, you follow the values of Torah and the teachings of the Torah, and you study Torah, and you recognize that you have to be a mensch as well. You study all that, it's a good land for you. On the other hand, if you ignore it, this land will not be very friendly and good to you. And therefore, it is a location where they have to learn this concept of a contrast, good and bad. Har Grizim and Har Eval were two mountains, but the commentators explain Har Grizim was a magnificent mountain full of life and vegetation. Har Eval was a barren mountain. And they stood right there, and they look and they see a contrast. When you see a contrast between something that is quite awesome and something that is quite depressing, you realize here that there's a lesson you could learn, when you drive in Florida. So there is a highway in Miami. Let's talk about Miami now. And a lot of good Jews here. So you could drive on the 90 there. And when you come to Miami Beach, 95, sorry. 95.
90 for you.
90 for me. So, you take the 95, it is true, because every north-south route is on. So you take the 95, and on the one side to the east is the magnificent areas, right, like Miami Beach and these expensive properties. Have you ever landed up on the other side of the 95?
Sure.
Right? Be careful. You have to say Hagomel after leaving it, because these are neighborhoods that are terrifying neighborhoods. Inner city, very dangerous. Don't, if you need, a washroom when you're there, just don't. Do me a favor. From experience, it's a very dangerous location. The contrast is unreal. You look at the contrast and you start asking yourself, what is America doing wrong? Or how do we deal with contrast? Brings about a question. When you see a contrast, you ask yourself, what do I have to do? And this is what our ancestors are experiencing. Welcome to Israel. Your actions are important, and the lesson will be learned through this contrast. That is what's happening, and therefore he arrives in that region. So if we remember that, and we remember that he is in that region, it will clarify a few other things. But let's move on to verse 7. Okay, so far what we know is Elon Moreh, location number 1, Elon Moreh. That is where Abraham arrives, and that is where he begins his journey in Israel. Verse 7, God appears to Avram, and he tells him, and this is good news for a person who has no children, Lizaracha eten et haaretz hazot, your offspring will get this land. And he's grateful to God. Vayiven sham mizbeach, at the end of verse 7, he builds the altar to the God who appeared to him. And then he makes a move. Where does he move to? Vayatek misham hahara. He makes his way to the mountains, which are to the mountain. Mikedem leBetel, so we are introduced to a new location, which is Betel. And he establishes a tent. He pitches his tent, and then he is going to begin his journey of calling out in the name of God. Now, what does that mean at the end of that verse? Vaikra b'shem Hashem, you invoke Hashem's name. Now remember, this is the second altar. The first altar was a personal altar to God, being grateful for the fact that he is told that this land is going to be given to his children. The second altar is achieving something very, very different, because here he is calling out in the name of God. And commentators explain, and this is the most logical explanation, Abraham has a desire that humanity should recognize God, meaning that spiritual experience he had, which it is natural for the spiritual being to want to detach from society and just meditate. And that is what is actually done by many in that world. Abraham recognizes that a spiritual experience is to turn around and interact with society and to inspire them, not just to learn, but to teach. And to call out in the name of God is to interact in a very welcoming, right? The tent of Abraham, open from four sides. He interacts with people. He is welcoming to people. And then after he deals with all their difficulties, perhaps emotional or physical, he turns to them and says, you know what, there is a God. Let's talk about what our responsibility to God is. He doesn't want this pagan nonsense, this Narishkeit. That's not how you relate to the higher being. It's not how you bring blessing. You're not, by dancing, you're not going to have rain, but by being righteous, you're going to have rain. This is what he is doing. He is calling out and invoking the name of God. That is what he does between two locations. That is what he does between two locations. And this is the beginning of his journey of teaching, as we'll see soon, contrast to the society that lived there. Now, where exactly, or in between, what locations does he build this altar? So let's go through the two locations. Location number 1, verse 8. Correct, Betel, number 1. Number 2, the next, it was between Betel Miyam. So Betel was to the west of him. to the Yam, the Tichon, right? And the name of the city that was to the east was Ha'ai Mikedem. Ha'ai. Ai. Okay, what does that mean? What's its significance? So now Bet El is a location that perhaps the name was given later, but what is clear to us, it is a very positive name. The house of God, or the house of a strong one. A house that's intact, right? When there is values in a house, it's a structure that is intact. Bet El is this intact structure, and that's what's positioned on one side of his message. What's positioned on the other side of the message, of the other side of his class or lecture or sermon? So I'm going to read to you from Tehillim. There is a Mizmor that talks about the destruction of Yerushalayim. Okay, so I have here Tehillim, chapter 79, where Mizmor le'asaf. It's a Mizmor, which you have to ask, why is it a Mizmor if we're going to be talking about the destruction of the Bet HaMikdash? So the Talmud explains that when a structure is destroyed but the people survive, that's something to be grateful for. Meaning to have a structure standing and no Jewish people, that would be a kinah, that would indeed be a complete destruction. But nevertheless, there's one word I want to focus on. So we turn to God and we say, Elokim, ba'u goim benachalatecha. God, these nations came to your chosen location. Timu, they have defiled. Et heichal kodshecha, your holy temple was defiled by them. Samu et Yerushalayim, they made Yerushalayim into Iyim. Ein, Yud, in the plural, Yud Mem, Iyim. What's Iyim? They made Yerushalayim into a pile of rubble. It looks like waves of rubble. They destroyed Yerushalayim. This is what we are told in this chapter. Now, if Iyim means location that is destroyed, so that is obviously the opposite of a standing structure, of a structure that has the presence of God in it, perhaps a temple, Bet El. So this gives us a little bit of clarity. What is occurring in verse 8? Avraham, who wants to follow this future pattern of teaching the people who are present there that there is a God and you have responsibility. And he wants to use this educational idea of contrast. He places them between Bet El, the standing structure that has in it God, and contrasts it to a E. Okay? So back to the verse again. Vayeto ala Beit El miyam veha'ai, the same exact word as a pile of rubble, is mikedem. And then he begins the process of reaching out and teaching. So far, what we have up until this point is Abraham believes that he is just continuing his journey. And if we would interview Abraham at that point, right before we reach verse 9, and we ask him, welcome to Israel, what's your agenda here? He said, my agenda is to be here, appreciate the land, but at the same time, teach people about God, and I plan to remain here, and God willing, God just told me, I just got an update from God that I'm going to have children, and this land is for me. From this point on, everything is going to go just as I envision, right? But in the next verse, there's going to already be an indication that things are not exactly the way he envisioned it, okay? Vaisa Avraham haloch v'naso anegma. Verse 9, he journeyed on, but it doesn't tell us where he is going. All we are told is that, for whatever reason, he's getting pushed to the south. Pushed to the south. Have you been to the Negev? Now, Baruch Hashem, in this day and age, there's a lot happening in the Negev, and this is something we could appreciate. But historically, when you talk about Israel, there was always life in the north, right? There was growth in the north. The desirable regions of Israel are more to the north. The south was a great place, but you cannot call it a place of life. You talk about it, Hebron was designated for graves. The Negev, the word naguv, something that is completely dry. There's no life there. And Avraham is making his way in that direction. And what's the idea behind it? So it works as follows. So here we're going to have to halt up for a few minutes. You remember, every single day we have a Shemona Esrei. And in it we turn to God and we ask Him for all kind of good things, like wisdom, which happens to be beneficial, right? Wisdom, forgiveness. And then we turn to God and we ask Him for parnasa, what's known as a year of prosperity. Barech Aleinu, right? Barech Aleinu, bless upon us this year, its crops. In it we have in mind the stock market as well, or for some perhaps the value of real estate, whatever industry you're involved in. Right, the government should not machim meshugah. Anything that relates to finances, you pray for next year. Anything that relates to finances, you turn to this blessing. Baruch atah Hashem, blessed are you, God, who blesses the years. Right after that, we enter into a blessing that talks about the ingathering of the exiles. Okay, blessing, abundance in the yield of the land, and then we talk about a return to the land of Israel. So the Talmud tells us that there is a very strong connection between the two, because there is a section in the Talmud that talks about the Mashiach. We Jews believe in this idea of a future Redeemer and a redemption. And we talk about a return to the land of Israel. We've been doing it for thousands of years, and things that if we have difficulty imagining it, it is easier for us now than people in the shtetl 140 years ago. Now, when we talk about a return to the land of Israel in the Messianic era, there has always been an urge, this desire, to try to figure out when He is coming. And throughout the ages, there were great chachomim, quote unquote, who tried to give the exact dates of when the Mashiach is going to come. Now, the one thing they all have in common, there were many different dates given. The one thing they have in common is that they were all wrong. Meaning everyone gave their predictions, and unfortunately, often these years brought excitement, especially if you were mystical, if you were a Kabbalist. And come the year 840, so many people were convinced in the year 840 is going to come. And there was great excitement in the year 1240. There are many different times that people are excited. He doesn't show up now. The Talmud addresses this concept. Then the Talmud tells us, you know what, I want to know the bottom line. You're looking for a sign that the Messiah is on his way, that things are changing. So the Talmud quotes a verse from the book of Yechezkel, where we are told that Eretz Yisrael eventually will be producing magnificent fruit. And the yield of the land will be tremendous. When, the Talmud tells us, you see the produce of Eretz Yisrael, of high quality, of great taste, right? When the wines of Israel are winning awards, chakelo, then you should start, then that is the obvious and only obvious sign. This is what we are being told. So as an optimistic person, I do believe that while many of you remember that Israeli wine was sugary goods that were not desired, like syrup, exactly. Now you pick up, after drinking Israeli wine, you pick up something from Italy and France, you can't touch it in essence, because you know that the high quality wines do come from Israel. So there's something there that is happening. Now, but let's try to analyze it a little bit deeper. What exactly is the idea behind it? In other words, Mashiach, we're talking about Mashiach, food, right? What's the idea behind it? So, what we have to remember is, we talk about the word galut, and we talk about the word geula. Usually, people refer to the idea of galut as something that's geographic. Now, we are in the galut, right? My brother, I have a big Zionist brother, who made Aliyah a year and a half ago, very proud of it, and he's been, I'm not going to use the word brainwashing his kids, because I do believe in it as well, but they've been guided from a very young age that you have to go be there, and everything in Israel is good, And in that household, by my brother and my sister-in-law, you say anything, right, that is not positive about Israel, you're in deep trouble. And there's a WhatsApp group among in the family itself. And once in a while, one of the siblings here decides that they're going to post something to agitate him, and it's very, very fascinating what occurs. And so that's what he does. So now, this brother now this week is in Boston. He lectures, whatever. So he arrives in Boston. So we wake up Sunday morning, and already at 6 a.m. he posts a picture, and the picture has a big cup of Starbucks. Okay, in other words, even this big Zionist knows that there's some. But on the bottom he writes Galut. Galut. Not a So we always relate the concept of Galut to geography. The truth is, it has really a lot more than that. We are believers. God created this world. God wants us to recognize Him. He wants us to be happy, by the way. He wants us to appreciate it. And He wants us to live by a set of values that are good for us in this world as well. And we are told that when we do what we are supposed to do, the physical world acts and does what it's supposed to do as well. Okay, that's the natural state. So now, Galut is when things are not aligned. In other words, when we are not doing what we are supposed to do as a nation, that too is a galut, right? When we are not there geographically, that's also a galut. But there's another galut, and that is when Israel is not producing good fruit, right? When you visit Israel 200 years ago, like Mark Twain, right? And you notice that there's nothing really happening there, that these locals are not, there's a galut, because when it's Israel's natural state should be with Jews there. Israel's natural state should be with Jews doing what they are supposed to do as Jews. And Israel's natural state is that there should be magnificent produce. That is Geulah, that's redemption. And when all that happens, then you can expect it in a Beit HaMikdash as well, when everything is aligned. Now, when Israel starts producing fruit, as the Talmud tells us, that is a sign that the alignment is beginning. We are returning to Israel. Look what's happening. Look what's happening. Look at the 20th and the beginning of the 21st century. There's an alignment. There's an alignment from many, many different ways. Physically, right? The percentage of Jews that were in Israel, right? 120 years ago among the Jewish people. Very small. Now it's the largest Jewish population, and very soon the majority of Jews are in Israel. There's an alignment that's happening. Next, when it comes to behavior, Israel is becoming more of a religious country, right? You have to be careful. Religious could be a very dangerous thing, but if it's used appropriately and it's used in a positive way, in the ways the media does not cover, because it's occurring every single day that there are Jews acting in Israel the way they should and doing incredible things and being very sensitive, and there's a lot of unity the media does not touch about, that too is part of this alignment. When those things are aligning as they are supposed to, the fruit of the land is going to become of better quality. Everything is aligned. Okay? So now, understanding that, Avraham Avinu makes his way to the land of Israel. And he starts the process of being a moreh, a teacher. He is a moreh. And he is achieving that in the north. The north symbolizes where there was vegetation, there was life, there was good fruit. Everything is aligned there. But something was pulling him south, and he arrives in areas near Hebron, and there exactly the alignment is not obvious at that time. Right? In other words, the land is not producing magnificent fruit. And as we know in the next chapter, it's even more than that. What happens in the next chapter in Israel? What's the status of food in the quote-unquote promised land? There's a famine. Things are falling apart. Now, when things are falling apart, you cannot get up there and tell the world that by sticking to the values of Torah, you'll be blessed. You're not blessed. In other words, there's a famine. How was Avraham Avinu able to stick to his message? Can you imagine his challenge? When things are declining in Israel, and he says, you listen to God, things are good. And they say, sir, what brought you here? Who told you to come here? God. Aha, are things good? Not really. How do you no longer are able to communicate the message to the world. But as Jews, and this is an important point, as Jews, we have to have the ability and willingness to stick to God even if we ignore the world. Even if the world thinks we're mishuga, even if the world does not understand, why are we sticking to our teachings? You think about what the Catholic Church was saying to the Jews throughout the years in Europe, right? You were rejected by God, right? You are away from your land, right? The Catholic Church or the Christians wanted Jews to suffer to exist in Europe, but they wanted them to suffer as a sign. This is what's happening when you don't accept what they believe in, right? We had to have that ability to rebel, to say, you know what? Even though you say that, and even though things are not aligned, we still accept God. Even though we were not able to communicate it and explain it and rationalize it, we couldn't be a moreh. Now there's another word that we must transfer. When we are able to educate the world, we have to be a moreh. But when we have to ignore the world and do what we believe is right, even though we cannot prove it and not present it in a way that they understand, we have to switch from a moreh to a mamreh. What's a mamreh? Mamrim heitem, like a little bit like a rebel. You have to be like a rebel. The world thinks you're mishuga, right? To go ahead, upstairs there's a cupboard there in the hallway upstairs, where there's a Talmud, and there is a Talmud Tractate Nedarim sitting there, printed probably late 1945, perhaps 1946, right? What's the significance of that Talmud? It's not so old. There's some older Talmuds out there. Significance is that these were Talmuds that were printed in DP camps after the war. And these Talmuds gave life, in essence, to many people who lost everything, but they were given something familiar, right? And the excitement, and there are stories of tremendous excitement of young students that finally, right, after years, right, of being kicked out from location to location, in ghetto, losing everyone in a gas chamber, all that, they have at least the Talmud. And they sat down and they studied Talmud, and it gave them comfort. Now, is that rational? Is that something you could explain to the world? I'm committed to God, and I could study the words of His Torah. After everything, you cannot explain it. It does not make any sense. But these are people that were like a mamreh. They're going to stick to Jewishness even if it doesn't make sense. It's tradition. Even if the world rejects us, and even if the world does not understand at all, why on earth do we continue with this commitment? We're going to be a mamreh. Okay, so there's a switch there that's occurring from the moreh. And Avraham, although the rest of his life he still interacts with people, he is going to learn the message of the South. He's going to learn the idea that Israel, that he's going to be what we are told by the rabbis, he went through challenges, right? He went through trials. And that is what we are learning about right here. Now, we turn to God, right? And we ask, we don't want that. In other words, you know the statement, Lama yomru agoyim ayeh lokechem, right? Where is your God? That was from the same chapter. Like the nations say, where is your God? Where's your God? We don't want that. In other words, we want to turn into a moreh again. We want to, but we have to have the willingness to stick to what we believe in and to be like a mamreh, like rebel against the nations, even when things don't go the way we want. Now, with that, let's briefly what happens is he goes to Egypt, not a good experience there. He makes his way out, God's with him. He has an issue with Lot, not something he expected. This is something that we suffer with as well, as when Lot represents in some ways the Jewish people as well, right? He does have the values of Avraham. And there is tension. This is also something of Galut. Avraham is being challenged, but he sticks to it. And that obviously will clarify if you turn to page 60. Turn to page 60. Now, God tells him, after he's gone through a lot, you're gonna get this line of worry. Not verse 18 of chapter 60. Where does he settle in the south? Where does he settle in the south? Vayal Avraham Okay, so he moved his tent, and he came and dwelt in the plains of Mamre. So this is really the switch from Elonei Moreh, the teacher, the Moreh, to Elonei Mamre, to be one who is willing to rebel. And this is what he is willing, this is what he accepts. Now, Mamre. The names are significant because if you look carefully, fast forward to page 64 if you don't mind, to the last line. When we talk about the people who accompanied Avraham, who were the Baalei Brit, who had a covenant with Avraham. So there are three personalities that are mentioned there, right? And if you look at these three personalities, you'll understand the message, what the Jew has to accept. And Avraham is getting it now. Earlier on, when he entered, he thought he's the Mr. Moreh. That's it. He's a Moreh. But then he learned that, yes, the Jew, number one, has to be a light upon the nations. No question about that. And that we have a responsibility to this concept always. We are a ner to the 70 nations. What's the letter 70 in Gematria? The Ayin. We have to be, we think of the 70 nations, we have to be a ner. And then we have to remember that as Jews, we have to appreciate the physical world. That's so much part of Judaism. To recognize that it's there for us, to say brachot, and to recognize its awesomeness. And when you talk about physical pleasure, what do we make kiddush with wine? Wine symbolizes the idea of physical pleasure. And when we have this eshkol, and throughout Tanakh you'll find the eshkol and the wine symbolizes physical pleasure, and Avraham has a role in telling the world this is how we relate to God, by appreciating the eshkol. However, you have to remember that the Jew, it's going to be a long journey until we reach Moreh state again, and you have to be a Mamre, and you have to do something that's irrational, like a Brit Milah. You have to do a Brit Milah. You know, the challenge of the mother, you know, the night before the bris, thinking, oh my goodness, like what on earth am I going to do? Then you have to remind yourself that, yes, perhaps it will make your kid Meshuggah, but we've been Meshuggah for 3,500 years, maybe as a result. It's not an easy experience. We do it, Hashem said so. Can you rationalize it? Not really. But you have to be a Mamre. And that idea that Avraham is getting a picture of his role becomes clear at the bottom of page 64 when we identify the colleagues and those who have a covenant with Avraham, and they are Aner, Eshkol, Mamre. Aner, Ain, Ner, being the light upon the nations. Eshkol symbolizes the Eshkol, the cluster of grapes. Eshkol, Anavim, symbolizing Jewish attitude towards physical pleasure. And a Mamre, rebelling. The willingness to tell the world, even if you think it makes no sense, I'm doing it anyway. And that obviously will clarify why in the beginning of next week's parasha, where does the Brit Milah, you know, the commentators explain that a Gentile who is righteous follows the 7 Noahide laws, which are logical. They are logical. When the male, at least, wants to convert, he does something that's not rational, the Brit Milah. The Brit Milah symbolizes this idea that we cannot explain it to the world. Right? It's not something that you could rationalize. You do it, God said so, you have to have that Mamre element. And therefore, Avraham Avinu, where does he have his Brit Milah? And where does God appear to him after that experience? Va'ira elav Hashem be'elonei Mamre. The Mamre. That's what's taking place. Now, we, as Jews, are optimistic. We do believe that better times are waiting for us. And eventually we could explain things to the world and relate to the world. And we're going to return to a mountain of Hora'ah, a mountain of teaching. A mountain where the world will understand and appreciate us and recognize that everything we've been committed to over these years indeed has a message that is good for the world. So our prayer is that there's going to be a Bet HaMikdash on Har HaMoriah, Moreh. We're going to return as Morim again. That is what we wait for. And that's a little bit of an idea of Avraham's journey, his challenges, and what eventually is waiting for the people of Israel. We thank our sponsors again, Neshama Shalav and Aliyah. Thank you all for coming, and have a good day.